The clockmaker's silence. The village of lost seconds. In Blackwood Hollow, time didn't just pass, it loitered. The village sat in a deep, verdant valley where the fog clung to the ground like a damp blanket, never quite lifting even at the height of noon. It was a place of steep gables, cobblestone streets slick with moss, and a reputation for harboring secrets that refused to surface. Elias Thorne did not like Blackwood Hollow. As a retired forensic accountant turned private investigator, Elias preferred clarity. He liked balance sheets, clear-cut audit trails, and the reassuring reliability of objective truth. Blackwood Hollow, with its penchant for local folklore and lingering shadows, was entirely too ambiguous for his tastes. Yet, here he was, standing before the iron gates of the Sterling estate, his trench coat soaked through with the persistent, freezing drizzle. Arthur Sterling, the village's master horologist, had been found dead 3 days ago. The local constabulary, led by a well-meaning but hopelessly out-of-his-depth Constable Miller, had ruled it a natural death, a heart attack. But Arthur's estranged niece, Clara, hadn't believed it. She had hired Elias because she knew her uncle hadn't just been a clockmaker, he had been a man terrified of the dark. Elias stepped inside. The air in the workshop was heavy with the smell of machine oil, ozone, and ancient dust. It was a symphony of ticking, hundreds of clocks, large and small, grandfathers and cuckoos, all marking the passage of time in a chaotic, unsynchronized chorus. Arthur Sterling lay slumped over his workbench. His body was frozen in a posture of desperate reach, one hand outstretched toward a massive, unfinished brass mechanism that dominated the center of the room. The door to the workshop had been locked from the inside, bolted by a heavy iron latch. The windows were painted shut, the seals undisturbed by time or interference. It was a classic impossible scenario. But Elias Thorne knew that the impossible was usually just the improbable hiding in plain sight. 2. The anatomy of an alibi. Elias began his work, not by interrogating suspects, but by auditing the room. He pulled a small notebook from his pocket. He didn't look for fingerprints, he left that to the amateurs. He looked for discrepancies. He walked the perimeter of the room. 1, 2, 3, he counted the clocks. 47. He noted the time on each one. 10:14. 10:17. 9:58. 10:02. They're all wrong, Elias murmured to himself. They were his life, a voice said from the doorway. Elias turned. It was Ilara, Arthur's longtime apprentice. She was a woman in her late 20s, with ink-stained fingers and eyes that seemed permanently focused on something just behind the person she was talking to. They aren't just his life, Ms. Vance, Elias replied, his voice calm. They are his accounting. A master horologist doesn't have 47 clocks in his workshop, all reading different times, unless there is a reason for the variance. He was a precisionist. This is a mess. Ilara stepped into the room, her movements bird-like and anxious. He was working on something new. The Chronos project. He said it would change everything. He stopped caring about the other clocks weeks ago. The Chronos project, Elias repeated, glancing at the brass behemoth on the workbench. And was he working on it when he died? I don't know, she whispered. I was in the village, buying parts. When I came back, the door was bolted. We had to break it down. He was already gone. Elias turned back to the workbench. He examined the tools. A screwdriver, a jeweler's loop, a set of fine-tipped tweezers. Everything was neatly organized, except for one thing, a ledger, half hidden beneath a pile of blueprints. He flipped it open. It wasn't a diary. It was a log of debts. Julian Sterling, minus £5,000. Mayor Higgins, minus £12,000. Elias felt a familiar spark of interest. Arthur Sterling wasn't just a clockmaker, he was the village moneylender. And he kept very accurate books. 3. The Debt of Time. The investigation moved to the local tavern, the Broken Cog, a place where the village hierarchy was laid bare over lukewarm ale. Julian Sterling, Arthur's nephew, was a man whose expensive suit was a poor camouflage for his desperate financial situation. He sat in the corner, nursing a whiskey, his face flushed with a nervous energy that Elias immediately identified as guilty. Uncle Arthur was eccentric, Julian said when Elias approached, his voice thick with unconvincing sorrow. He hoarded his wealth. I was his only living blood relative. It's only natural I would inherit his estate. And the £5,000 you owed him? Elias asked, pulling out a chair. Julian's eyes flickered. That was a misunderstanding. A loan for a business venture that went south. A venture involving offshore betting? Elias pressed, his tone mild. My audit of his ledger suggests he was about to report you for embezzlement, Julian. That's a powerful motive for a nephew with an inheritance looming. Julian stood up, his chair scraping violently against the floor. You're an outsider. You don't know how things work in Blackwood Hollow. Arthur was blackmailing half the village. He wasn't a saint, he was a parasite. A parasite who was locked inside a room with no way out, Elias noted, unfazed. Who had the key to the workshop, Julian? Only Arthur, Julian snapped. And Ilara. She's the only one he trusted with the internal mechanism. Elias watched Julian walk away. He had a suspect, but the logistics of the crime remained a locked gate. How do you kill a man inside a room that is locked from the inside, with no weapon and no exit? 4. The mechanism of murder. Elias returned to the workshop late that night. The fog had intensified, pressing against the glass panes like a living thing. He sat at the workbench, staring at the brass clock. He didn't try to solve the murder. Instead, he tried to solve the clock. He began to dismantle the casing. It was a masterpiece of gears and springs, more complex than anything he had ever seen. As he stripped away the layers of brass, he noticed a discrepancy in the weight distribution. One of the gears was made of a slightly different alloy, heavier, more dense. He traced the gear train. The movement was linked to the mainspring, but there was a secondary release, a timer. Elias froze. He understood the mechanism now. It wasn't a clock. It was a delivery system. He looked back at the ledger he had found earlier. The entries weren't just debts, they were schedules. He cross-referenced the names with the times on the clocks in the shop. Julian. Higgins. Ilara. Suddenly, the chaotic times of the 47 clocks made sense. They weren't broken. They were synchronized to individual events. Arthur Sterling hadn't just been tracking time, he had been orchestrating it. He had been creating a system to blackmail the entire village, using a mechanical device that would release incriminating information or perhaps something more dangerous at specific intervals. And then, he saw the final piece of evidence. On the floor, near the workbench, there was a tiny, microscopic scratch. It wasn't from a struggle. It was a friction mark. Something had been dragged across the floorboards. Elias knelt. He pulled up the floorboard. Beneath it lay a hidden compartment. Empty. He heard a soft click behind him. I wondered if you were clever enough to find that, Ilara's voice came from the shadows. Elias turned slowly. Ilara stood there, holding a small, silver pistol. Her hand was steady. You're an accountant, Mr. Thorne, she said, her voice devoid of its earlier nervousness. You deal in numbers. But some things don't add up. Like Arthur's heart attack. He wasn't killed by a person. He was killed by his own creation. A poison delivery system, Elias realized, his mind racing. The mechanism released a gas when the clock struck a specific hour. You rigged it. He was going to destroy us all, Ilara said, tears welling in her eyes, though her aim remained true. He had proof of everyone's crimes. He was going to expose the mayor, ruin Julian, and send me to prison for stealing his designs. He was a tyrant. I just accelerated the timeline. And the locked room? Elias asked, stalling for time. He did that himself. He always locked the workshop when he was working on the project. I just ensured the clock finished the job. You made a mistake, Elias said, his voice dropping to a whisper. You're a brilliant engineer, but you're a terrible accountant. What are you talking about? You assumed the ledger you stole from the compartment was the only copy. Arthur was a forensic perfectionist. He kept a digital backup on a server in the city. Ilara hesitated, her gaze wavering for a fraction of a second. That was all Elias needed. He threw the heavy brass clock mechanism at her. It wasn't a weapon, but the sheer weight of it was enough to knock the gun from her hand. The final audit. The aftermath was swift. The police arrived, the evidence was seized, and Ilara was taken into custody, her mechanical genius proving to be her undoing. Elias stood outside the workshop as the sun finally began to break through the fog of Blackwood Hollow. The village looked different now, cleaner, somehow. He opened his notebook one last time. He wrote down the final entry in the case of the clockmaker. Case closed. Motive, greed and fear. Method, mechanical sabotage. The books are balanced. He tossed the notebook into his briefcase and walked toward his car. He didn't look back at the workshop. He didn't look back at the clocks that were now, finally, all ticking in perfect, silent unison. Elias Thorne liked clarity. And as he drove away from the Valley of Lost Seconds, he finally found the peace that only a closed account could provide. The mystery was solved, not by genius or intuition, but by the cold, hard realization that every action, no matter how carefully hidden, leaves a trail. And for a forensic accountant, every trail eventually leads to the truth.